Hello, thank you for joining me. This is the second in a series of programs in which I explore the influence that the internal structure of sound, represented by the harmonic series, has had on the development of Western music since the Middle Ages. If you saw the previous video, you'll remember that we looked at the role played by the harmonic series in the perception of timbre, how the relative strength of the partials that make up the spectrum of a musical instrument determine its tone color. But timbre isn't the only element of music in which the harmonic series is a determining factor. In fact, this microstructure of musical sound also has a clear correlation with the macrostructures of pitch and rhythm. So in this program, we focus on the relationship between the frequency ratios present in the harmonic series and the qualities of musical intervals, and then we trace the evolution of melody and harmony with reference to these ratios, from the medieval to the classical periods. Since melody and harmony both rely on intervals, let's take a close look at them. Here's the harmonic series in notation once again. Let's note any recognizable intervals. You'll note that any pair of successive numbers also denotes the frequency ratio that forms the interval. Now we'll bring some of these intervals into a lower octave, bearing in mind that it's the frequency ratio, which would be the same whichever two pitches made up the interval, that matters. When we heard the notated harmonic series played, you will have noticed that the interval of the octave, in which the frequency ratio is 1 to 2, produces tones so strongly related that they sound equivalent. That's to say, we hear the upper note as being the same note but higher. We even give it the same letter name. We saw in the last program that Pythagoras is widely credited with establishing the mathematical relationship between string length and pitch. He noted that stopping a string halfway along its length produces a pitch 1 octave higher than the unstopped string. He went on to identify the intervals produced by stopping a third, a quarter, a fifth of the length, and so on. 600 years later, in the 2nd century, Ptolemy is thought to have formalized the basic intervallic content of the scales and modes in which the intervals produced by the ratios we just saw were all in the same octave. At least since the time of Pythagoras, musical intervals have been endowed with particular affective qualities. Everyone knows that a melody or a chord can provoke a very strong emotional response. And this is partly attributable to the qualities that we ascribe to the intervals that make them. It's long been noted that simpler frequency ratios, that's to say those with lower numbers, are perceived as stable, unlike those produced by more complex ratios. This was proposed by the 19th century physicist Hermann von Helmholtz. as the acoustical basis of the traditional musical concepts of consonance and dissonance, in which the simpler ratios created consonant intervals and vice versa. Of course, not everyone will have the same responses to intervals, but here are some of the more widely acknowledged ones. The unison is seen as stable, having power, symbolizing unity, whereas the octave has stability, also has power, unanimity, and finality. The fifth seems to suggest completeness, nature, expansiveness. The minor second seems to suggest tension, unease, conflict, or threat. And finally, the tritone, which seems to suggest ambiguity, conflict, uncertainty. So consonant and dissonant intervals, respectively considered stable or unstable, seem to trigger analogous emotional responses in listeners. We can conclude then that there is a firm connection between the frequency ratios that give rise to musical intervals and the feelings they evoke. Exactly which intervals were regarded as consonant has been subject to change over time. For example, in monastic medieval music, only the intervals formed by the very lowest ratios of the harmonic series were considered consonant. Even an interval that we accept as consonant, such as the third, was considered dissonant because it had a destabilizing effect. Originally, plainsong, Gregorian chant, was sung in unison. But during the 8th and 9th centuries, organum, which consisted of an original chant plus a parallel voice at the interval of the octave, the fifth, or the fourth, began to develop. So the intervals used corresponded to the first three partials of the harmonic series. Now, it seems unlikely that these intervals were chosen consciously. Rather, their adoption was probably due to some subliminal perception, assisted by acoustical and psychoacoustical phenomena. Now, although this may seem obvious, monastic music was mostly performed by adult males, monks or priests. The pitch of many of their notes would have been low enough for the upper partials to be well within the human audio frequency range. The lowest and most intense partials, that's to say those representing the octave and the fifth, would have been clearly discernible. Furthermore, these audible overtones would have been reinforced in two important ways. Firstly, when young boys' voices were added to those of the adults, the equivalence we talked about earlier would have come into effect. It would have sounded as though the boys were singing the same notes as the men, but they were in fact producing sounds of double the frequency, so the singing was in parallel octaves. Secondly, combination tones would have been heard. Initially, the 18th century violinist and composer Giuseppe Tartini, and subsequently the German physicist Hermann von Helmholtz, established that when two or more notes are sounded simultaneously, additional tones, which are the sums of and differences between their frequencies, are heard. So singing in unison would give rise to some tones at the octave. in effect reinforcing the first overtone of the harmonic series inherent in the singer's voices. As we mentioned, in time, another interval was introduced, the perfect fifth. Looking again at the harmonic series, we see that the third partial forming the interval of a compound perfect fifth with the fundamental would also have been audible, and there would have been awareness of a sumtone also at the interval of a compound fifth when chants were performed in parallel octaves. It would not have been unnatural for this tone eventually to be lowered by an octave, possibly also due to the phenomenon of equivalence. The other interval deployed in parallel organum was the perfect fourth. Now this could also have come about due to equivalence because the fourth is a fifth inverted, but it can be noted that it is in the harmonic series following the fifth and embodying the frequency ratio 3:4. The fifth overtone, which forms a compound major third with the fundamental, would also have been clearly audible. However, whilst it could be heard, and in that sense it was available, it was avoided for some considerable time because it was in fact considered dissonant. But by the Renaissance, the interval of the major third was fully established as a consonance, and the triad, a harmonic structure combining intervals that correspond to the fundamental plus the first 5 overtones of the harmonic series, was established as a basic building block of harmony. Triads could be based on all degrees of the scale. Due to the intervallic properties of the scales, triadic progressions exhibited an inclination to pull in certain directions. Because of triads' tendencies to exert varying degrees of attraction towards the tonic, by the 17th century the hierarchical system known as functional harmony had developed. The chord on the first degree of the scale, the tonic, became in effect the harmonic home base due to its strong feeling of stability and finality, and the triad on the 5th degree, the dominant, whose third, which is the leading note of the underlying scale, exhibited the strongest need to resolve onto the tonic. It's especially noteworthy that the dominant, the chord with the strongest gravitational pull, if you like, is that in which the constituent pitches are in the ratio 2:3. After the dominant, the chord in the hierarchy with the next most powerful attraction is that built on the 4th degree of the scale, the subdominant. Whereas the dominant, with its powerful pull towards the tonic, features pitches with frequencies in the ratio 2:3 to the tonic, the subdominant, which exerts a less powerful attraction, embodies frequencies in the ratio 3:4. The principal relationships within this hierarchical structure of functional harmony thus demonstrate close correlations to the ratios of the most prominent partials of the harmonic series. Once modulation had become a frequent feature of music, the key most often modulated to was the dominant. It's difficult to escape the conclusion that this too was due to an intuitive awareness of the most prominent ratios of the harmonic series, since a modulation to the dominant essentially involves the frequencies of the home key being multiplied in the ratio 2:3. In other words, 1 times 1.5. Octave displacements of the resulting pitches would exhibit the equivalence we discussed before. Possibly, the simplest means of modulating to more distant keys was to move from one key to another in which the original frequencies were multiplied by 1.5, and then repeat this from a new key, in other words, via the cycle of fifths. Since a complete cycle of fifths encompasses all the degrees of the chromatic scale, by using this as a modulating device, it's possible to progress to more and more distant keys or indeed to come full circle. So it starts to become clear that from the Middle Ages, harmonic development has involved the gradual acceptance of intervals representing higher, increasingly less simple ratios of the harmonic series, starting with the octave, then the fifth, then the fourth, and eventually leading to intervals which would, in earlier times, have been unthinkable. For example, the dominant seventh and diminished seventh chords, both commonly used in the Baroque era and beyond, contain the intervals of the minor seventh and the tritone. The diabolos in musica, as it was known in relation to medieval monastic music. However, in the context of functional harmony, these once unimaginably dissonant intervals assumed important enriching roles. For example, the minor seventh and diminished fifth in the dominant seventh chord intensified the need for resolution, with the ascending tendency of the leading note being mirrored by the descending tendency of the minor seventh towards the third of the tonic chord. Likewise, the diminished seventh chord, which features two tritones, possesses the principal characteristic of ambiguity, and so creates a high degree of flexibility as regards choices of harmonic progressions and modulations. Although by the end of the Baroque era dissonances such as these were commonplace, their functions didn't change for centuries. While the range of dissonances that provided roots to other keys or that intensified the need for resolution were accepted, there could be no question of their being admitted in any context other than that of functional harmony, until the 20th century, that is, and we're going to look at that in much more detail in the next program. During the classical period, sonata form became the standard model. In the sonata, the symphony, the string quartet, and other forms of chamber music, a first movement in sonata form was the norm. Possibly after a short introduction, a first subject or subject group in the tonic key led by way of a modulating transition to a second subject in the key of the dominant. Following a section which would develop the melodic aspects of the first and second subjects while moving to more distant keys, the music would return to state both the first and the second subject groups, but this time both in the tonic key. So even the workings of this large-scale and often complex structure relied heavily on the tonic-dominant relationship, and therefore on the frequency ratio of 2:3. Sonata form became a medium in which composers could demonstrate degrees of ingenuity by taking the listener on a conceptual journey, leading them away from the home key into less familiar territory, but eventually giving them satisfaction when all was resolved and when the tonic key was firmly re-established. The symbolic implications of sonata form thus became increasingly apparent, and as we shall see, composers exploited its potential as a vehicle for dramatic, extra-musical expression. In the hands of Beethoven, for example, the greatly extended development section, featuring modulations to more remote keys and deploying ever more daring dissonant harmonies along the way, revealed sonata form as possessing extraordinary expressive properties. We'll discuss this and the developments in melody and harmony that, together with their relationship to the ratios of the harmonic series that occurred during the late classical and romantic periods and in the early 20th century, in the next program. If in the meantime you have any comments or questions, please do leave them in the section below. If you know anybody else who might be interested in this topic, do please share with them. And also subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you don't miss the next program. So I hope this has been interesting and I hope it's been useful to you. Thank you very much again for joining me, and I very much hope that you will join me again.